Now, I would like to welcome Mr. Harsh Bedi. Mr. Harsh Bedi is a lawyer and the founder of a mandate project. This mandate project is to facilitate better coordination between experts, civil society, and policy practitioners on various issues to promote, accountability, transparency, and the efficient functioning of the governmental system. And he has special interest in policy and international relations. And he has been working on governance structures, policy networks, regulatory frameworks, and problem solving through tech-based innovations. Harsh is, basically coming from, Stephens College and Campus Law Center, Law Faculty, Delhi University, and he has also graduated from the Graduate Institute, Geneva. He has a wide knowledge, well-experienced, lawyer. And very recently, he led a very successful nationwide campaign, a consultation program on draft EIA notification 2020. So this has really helped the Ministry of Environment Forest. The report has been submitted to the ministry. So I very warmly welcome Harsh to share his views on the role of technology in promoting democracy. Over to you, Harsh.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, sir. Am I audible?
Yeah, very much. Yeah.
Okay. So good afternoon. No, it's still morning. So it's been moved forward. I was assuming that we would be starting I would be starting later.
Yes.
So good morning, everyone. It's still morning. It's an honor to be on today's panel with such distinguished speakers. I've already had the privilege of working under the guidance of Dr. L. Pushpakumar, and I've interacted with Dr. Consultative Reddy on a previous occasion, which is the EIA consultation program that Sir mentioned. So it's wonderful to see both of you again. I've been listening carefully to Dr. Pushottam Reddy and Dr. Narasimha Reddy, and thank them for their educative talks, which have covered the history, values, and threats to democracy quite comprehensively. And they've raised very important points. So I'll do my best to avoid restating what they've already covered as best I can. I'd like to begin by placing our discussion on democracy in the present context, identify certain challenges, and then move towards the role of technology in promoting democratic practices. So I'll be speaking of democracies generally and will situate the discussion on India at certain points. Now, in the context of COVID-19, with COVID-19, we are facing a global health crisis, which has turned into an economic crisis. As we can see, the measures implemented by governments across the world have been largely reactionary rather than based on a systematic and prepared response. We witnessed governments enacting emergency provisions to enforce lockdowns, and there has been a consequent centering of power in the executive branch of the government. This is likely to have long-term and far-reaching consequences. While such measures are not undemocratic in themselves, they do tend to undercut civil liberties and participatory decision-making, good electoral practice, institutional checks and balances, non-discrimination, and media independence. I think the risk of such erosion alone is sufficient reason to keep constant vigil on the short and long-term effects of growing centralized power. While assessing state action during a crisis, it's important to keep in mind that measures must be proportionate and justified for protecting lives. Certain measures, such as restrictions on democratic activities and silencing of critical voices, of course, remain undesirable. As the previous speakers have also mentioned, community participation must be supported and encouraged in responding to not just the health crisis, but also for other policy issues. I will return to this in a moment. So various political scientists have pointed out how the performance of any state in dealing with health and other crises seem to depend largely on two key factors. The first is state capacity. Very simply, this is whether if there are enough people and resources to meet the urgent needs of the crisis. The second thing is social trust, which is that the state must be trusted by the people, since their cooperation and collaboration is essential in effectively meeting the challenges posed by the crisis. The question on a lot of people's mind is, are democracies better than authoritarian regimes at handling pandemics? It's difficult to draw conclusions because of the dynamic nature of the crisis, wherein the situation in any country might change drastically in a matter of days or weeks. Additionally, the evaluation of responses is made difficult by the lack of any common reporting systems. Also, the form of government is only one among several factors which determines the success or failure of a state's response. In terms of democracies, we've seen very different results in the cases of New Zealand, the UK, and the United States. So I think it might be more worthwhile to ask, how is democracy transforming or evolving in the present scenario? It's been noted that democracy was already in serious trouble before the pandemic. Only now the fault lines are conspicuously exposed. We see disappointment at the ineffectiveness of democracy. Liberal institutions are you able to hear me? I think there was some issue.
Yes, yes, we are able to hear you. Yes.
Sorry. So there's a move towards conservative or an extreme are being dismantled and hollowed out. To be sure, these values include free flows of information, government and officials being responsive to citizens' needs, citizens in turn trusting their government, and a perception that government acts only in public interest. In such a situation, states are able to use resources to reach deep and work with civil society, experts, and others to develop coordinated, effective responses. So in an article that I recently read in The Lancet, it showed how studies of previous health crises suggest that citizens are more likely to comply with health measures over the long term where they feel their voices are included in government decisions. Okay, so I know this paints a slightly grim picture, but there is, of course, another story as well. While COVID has triggered anti-democratic restrictions in some places, it has also incentivized innovative pro-democratic efforts and initiatives. Signs of stronger democratic resolve are evident in increasing civic activism despite rigid restrictions. So the real threat associated with COVID-19 emergency measures has spurred campaigns to monitor abuse of rights by governments during the health emergency. New civic practices and initiatives have allowed support being provided to the most vulnerable parts of society. Efforts aimed at complementing state capacity have been helping provide medical supplies or food, as we've seen in India, as the support has come from NGOs, from private actors, celebrities, etc. And these programs help in assisting members of vulnerable local communities and running social support schemes. Most importantly, we also see a remarkable expansion of volunteerism as people have time to reflect on their situation in the bigger picture. I know this paints a slightly idealistic picture, and there are, of course, various challenges in a broad reach for such initiatives and measures. So in the context of the challenges and the opportunities pointed out, what role can technology play in safeguarding democracy and improving governance? I think the most obvious role technology can play is in providing access to information, which in the context of a pandemic ensures government cover-ups don't cost lives. Importantly, in democracies, people can vote against governments that perform badly in the crisis. The hope and the assumption in a perfect scenario is that electoral accountability should give leaders good incentive to enact good policies. However, this entire expectation is defeated when information is made unavailable. So it must be emphasized that it's essential that governments remain committed to democratic values, practices, and processes in a meaningful manner by being open and easing access to data. So turning our focus to India in particular, and speaking on technology, it seems that over time, internet communication technology holds the potential of becoming a great equalizer in a diverse, unequal, and developing country like ours. As we have noticed, steadily improving infrastructure and increasing smartphone ownership, though of course this remains limited in terms of the penetration into the rural heartland, is improving communication and access to information. We also see the increasing spread of economic and social benefits as technology facilitates payment transactions, easy remittances across the country, and giving access to larger markets for sellers. Of course, again, it is still not complete because of the uneven access to such technology. Service delivery mechanisms for state support have also been facilitated through technology. So in this context, it seems that business and other sides having been covered, governance is poised to be perhaps the next great space of tech-based innovation, which is already underway to some extent. So at this point, I want to discuss an interesting case, which is that of Estonia. And Estonia, several years down the road, if we embark on an effort to move governance service delivery mechanisms online. It is, of course, also important to keep in mind that Estonia is a very small country with a largely homogeneous population, which makes it easier to create and implement such systems. I'm quite aware of what kind of difficulties and challenges would be faced in a country like ours. Is they created online systems, provided a unique digital identification, and I know some people may think of the Aadhaar initiative as something akin to this, but it's important to note how data protection and safeguarding the data of citizens was key to the design of the structure from the get-go. And because of such safety measures being implemented, they were able to move certain key services online, for instance, filing of their taxes. They began voting all the way back in 2005. At this point, 99% of all public services in Estonia are available online. It would take you just about 5 minutes to file your taxes. And 1/3 of citizens exercise the facility of voting online. Of course, traditional in-person voting still continues. And more importantly, in the context of the pandemic that we're in, you also see that healthcare data is consolidated online. The entire history of patients, what kind of procedures they've had, what kind of medication, etc., they've received, is safely stored online. The citizens themselves are the owners of this data, and any access made by any state service to such data is immediately notified to the citizen. So Estonia is not alone, as other countries are also attempting to incorporate innovations which support and help democratic institutions regain legitimacy. New type of democratic processes are emerging. For instance, we see digital debates. As a large number of democratic forums have sprung up, there is an attempt to link citizens into the decision-making process through the use of social media and other tools. We also see an attempt to implement digital voting, as many countries are looking at how to extend online voting for public and parliamentary institutions, while of course addressing the important digital vulnerabilities in order to make these practices more fully secure. Other notable emergent innovations in democratic participation include online protests. I think all of us would remember the spamming of the account of the Minister for Environment in response to the environment impact assessment notification and the public consultation that happened. I think Fridays for Future spearheaded this, and we saw what resistance they were met with. We also see parliamentary digitization. So the UK, most notably, broke with 700 years of tradition during the pandemic and had a hybrid sitting of the parliament, where the bulk of the House joined via Zoom conference because of health-related considerations during the pandemic. We also see steps to improve accountability, mechanisms for oversight of elections and democratic institutions. So what I'm trying to get at here is that technology can create new access points to deal with specific policy challenges that require deeper change. This, however, must be approached in a manner that counters resistance to change from different quarters by being as inclusive and, most importantly, accessible to all. Because the worst thing that you can do is to perpetuate inequality through the digital divide, which exists in not just India, but in many other countries in the developing world. Also, in terms of a concrete example of how democratic practices have adapted to the changed circumstance currently, we see that presently there are restrictions on physical movement and limitations to gathering, for instance, demonstrations against questionable laws, etc. So we see how, for instance, the resistance to the EIA was met by civil society organizations and initiatives online. Now, even as Dr. Narasimha Reddy pointed out, it is not fully representative at this stage because of problems of access. but at least there is a movement in the direction of exploring such avenues. So at that point, I'd also like to just point out an interesting thought that came to mind in this context, which is regarding resistance to change. And I want to frame this in a feasibility versus willingness debate. So in terms of resistance to change, and that means adapting to new technologies also, it's commonsensical that this primarily flows from those who benefit from the status quo. With the pandemic, you see an important disruptive event, and such disruptions often lead to loosening of existing values and systems insofar as they are incompatible with the changed circumstance. So to give an illustration, we can look at the judiciary. For many years, there has been a call for moving hearings online in order to ease access to the judicial system, especially for people in remote corners, and also to ease and facilitate access to justice. So the resistance that comes to this has primarily taken the form of arguments on the grounds of impossibility or feasibility. However, when physical hearings were made impossible during the pandemic, the adoption of new technology became the only way forward. So the tools for online hearings were developed and implemented, though it's happened in a limited fashion, and you see the Supreme Court and various high courts adopting this technology. It'll still take time for it to be implemented across the board, even to the lower judiciary, etc. So what we see here is that what was discussed in the vein of a feasibility problem is actually a willingness problem to some extent. There, of course, are feasibility concerns as well. But once such changes are initiated, they set important precedents, which at the very least, at least challenge resistance on the previous grounds of feasibility and impossibility. So again, while such innovations are promising and likely to help revive certain institutions, the primary challenges in a country like India with its diverse population, uneven distribution of resources and access to technological infrastructure will require a concerted effort on the part of the government, but also on the part of civil society in order to become effective. So a duty must be placed on both the state and civil society actors to ensure meaningful access is provided to all, by ensuring the development of infrastructure, provision of access to resources, and ensuring necessary training and education is provided to utilize services which can be then accessed by all. And another very important thing which Dr. Narasimha Reddy also pointed out before is regarding privacy and confidentiality. These are integral to the system and must be incorporated in the system design from its inception. We currently do not have a strong and robust data protection regulatory framework. And in the absence of such a framework, e-government is unthinkable because of the risk of misuse of sensitive data. And with that, I want to shift the discussion towards public trust, which I'd mentioned as one of the key factors determining the performance of various regimes in responding to not just health crisis, but other complex policy challenges. So I want to discuss a possible case for using technological innovation to mend some of the damage sustained by an institution which earlier enjoyed a great deal of public trust. And I'll use the case of the Election Commission. So in the past year, it was noted how the Election Commission, some of its legitimacy seemed diminished when it was unable or unwilling to pull up the ruling party for violations of the Model Code of Conduct. Now, in November of this year, we know that the Bihar elections will be coming up, and this will be the first state to go to the polls amidst the pandemic. The EC has already released guidelines, effectively ruling out postponement, and they have made certain provisions for concerns regarding the healthcare crisis. For instance, the last hour of polling for those tested with high fevers or symptoms of the virus. We've also seen an adoption of new technology. So we see campaigning has been happening virtually. Preparatory meetings and consultations between the Election Commission and state administration have also moved online. Now, it remains to be seen if going forward with an in-person election is a good or a bad decision. If it turns out to be bad, a possible future innovation to prevent a repetition of such an issue would involve attempting to take elections online. Now, in a country like ours, again, there are a lot of problems with doing that, and you cannot make it mandatory. But if the option and systems are explored, perhaps at least it will set in place a system that can be developed and made accessible to all. We know it's possible. As I mentioned, we have the example of Estonia. And such a move would require willingness on the part of the government to ensure meaningful access to such resources and provide these to all citizens. So the technological gap does not perpetuate an access gap for citizens exercising their democratic rights. So at this point, I'll move to concluding, and I just want to point out a few things that I think would help light a possible way forward. So there appears to be a need for systematic support for the new democratic civic activism that the pandemic has sparked. There must be an effort to develop emergent innovations in democratic participation, electoral practices, political party organization, and institutional oversight. Trust within communities and towards governments is a key feature that strengthens effective public policies. While it's not unique to democracy, such trust can be more easily fostered through bottom-up inclusion and pluralism. So community participation remains key, and it matters because unpopular measures risk low compliance. Community input can help include voices of marginalized and vulnerable groups and identify solutions. They know what knowledge is circulating, can provide insights into stigma and structural barriers, and are well placed in the community to devise collective responses. Mechanisms to ensure citizen participation are essential for high quality, inclusive disaster response and preparedness. And these can be called upon in future emergencies as well. Also, finally, such institutions create scripts and pathways that can be adapted to decision making in other contexts and be utilized for dealing with complex policy issues, which require a collaborative and coordinated response. For instance, perhaps in tackling environmental degradation. So to ensure democratic governance in the pandemic and post-pandemic circumstances, countries will need to develop innovative approaches for holding elections, take steps to enable the effective functioning of democratic institutions, improve parliamentary oversight of the executive, and most importantly, increase citizens' participation in the political process. The positive role of technology in spreading quick and in-depth information, disseminating preventive messages, and increasing public access to healthcare services has already been noted. Through the use of various apps and tools, it enables community participation in the collective response to the disease. From compliance to lockdown to deciding and implementing steps to be taken to ease restrictions, to community support through volunteering. All of these are made much easier now in comparison to past times, where the spread of communication was much slower than that of the disease itself. So with that, I'd like to thank the organizers and Professor Lakshmanan for the introduction and to all the other speakers for their views. And I look forward to hearing from the others.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Harsh. Very, very nice, inputs. You have very rightly pointed out the context of e-governance in a thriving democracy like India. And you have very rightly associated this with several aspects, including the Bihar elections, how we are going to test, see the thing happening there. I'm really wondering that, is it the time that, because this is a pandemic time, going, in large number to the voting booths will definitely be a biggest concern for all of us. Is it the right time to think about technology, electronic voting rights, electronic voting, will it be possible? So I think, we need to innovate, in this context also. Being a largest democracy in the world, India has major responsibilities in innovating the democratic systems. And you have also, one point, very important point that I like here in the context is the developing the trust in democracy. And that's really a crux of the democracy. So why we need to stick to democracy is that we trust that, and how we are able to perpetuate that, how we are able to give that, to the, connecting the larger masses, that all the community interests are, really taken care of, so that the trust prevails in a democratic governance. So I think, this is the, really very important point in the contribution that you have made. Thank you very much, Harsh, for your valuable time and insights.